Hello everyone, welcome to this week's house church. We have made it to the very last beatitude, which I think is a really grand effort given how just disconnected and crazy things have been this year, but we're there. So we're nearly finished this series on the Sermon on the Mount. So today in your house church, we're going to be looking at this last beatitude, and I really hope that in the mix of all that happens, your group has some really great and energizing discussion about how we can understand what this beatitude brings to our life in terms of how we follow Jesus. So we find this beatitude right at the very end of the list of beatitudes, the little ladder of beatitudes that Jesus gives us. And it's this, in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, Matthew says, and Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And so this is the very last beatitude. And in a way, you could say it's like two beatitudes, but the same one repeated. And that repeating something is like a little thing that the rabbis used to do to emphasize something. And so the fact that Jesus says, "This blessed are those who are persecuted," and he kind of repeats himself twice, really indicates to us something about the importance of this very last beatitude. And so there's so many, like all of them, so many directions we can go with this, so many ways we could unpack it, so many ways we could attempt to apply it to our lives. And we can only really do that in a kind of specific and somewhat narrow way, like today. So just want to acknowledge that there's lots of layers to this, lots of different ways we can understand it and grasp it. But I guess I'm just going to lead us to look at it in one particular way today. And right from the outset, I guess I just need to acknowledge that in order for this discussion to have the most meaning for us, I'm going to, I guess, challenge us to look at what this means for us in our, modern Australian context. So I fully acknowledge that for different peoples and different people groups around the world, and for all the followers of Jesus who've read this beatitude within their own context at different times throughout history, we all would have understood it in different ways. And look, to be honest, we have to acknowledge that here in Australia, we don't actually really experience that much persecution. So in light of the fact that most of our lives are not at risk in following Jesus, I feel like we need to be able to somehow dive into this beatitude in a way that still challenges us, even though in some senses we're quite removed from a more literal understanding of this beatitude. So I just want to say that from the outset, that I acknowledge that none of our lives are at risk from following Jesus in that sense of, persecution unto death. But that's not the case for everyone and all Christians throughout history. So we stand in quite a privileged position as we read the words of Jesus here. And I think we need to understand that. And I think that, means that we need to understand there's a difficulty for us maybe to really embrace the fullness of what Jesus is getting at. A difficulty for us in embracing the utter blessing that persecution brings, simply because we're not actually that persecuted for our faith. And I feel like, there are things today that Christians might speak about in terms of feeling persecuted, but to be honest, I'm not really sure if some of the things that get thrown around in Christian culture about persecution could actually be called genuine persecution in terms of what Jesus is talking about here. So I've done this really oversimplistic and quite crude graph. I don't know if you can see that. If I show it to you, I'm going to lose my face. But anyway, I did this little graph, if you can see it. And what I've this is really not going to work. I should edit this out. But anyway, what I've done is, here we go. I'll move to the side. There we go. This is the death of Jesus, this is a graph of power over time. And if we're going to be honest with a very generalized reading of Christian history, we have to acknowledge that really for the first 300 years of Christian history, Christians were persecuted and people were martyred for their faith. But in about 313 AD, when Constantine became emperor of Rome and converted to Christianity, the persecution of Christians in many ways ceased because Christianity got in bed with power. And this is my little, the church got in bed with power. So we have held power for much of the last, 1500 years, I would say. And so in terms of talking about in the generalized Christian West, are we persecuted for our faith? Not really, because we have actually in many ways sat at the top of the power tree. And probably somewhere about the time of the Enlightenment, maybe in the 1700s, 1800s, our grip on power in some senses started to decline to a point where today we would say that, Christians don't necessarily sit at the center of power structures, but we're still pretty up there. And I guess I wanted to show you this because I'm hesitant for any Christian to talk about the loss of this feeling of power, to label that feeling of loss as persecution, I think is a little bit misguided. We are losing power. We are no longer at the center. Our morals, our Bible is not at the center of society anymore. Increasingly in Australia and many parts of the world where our society is becoming increasingly secular. Does that mean that Christians are being persecuted? I'm hesitant to say that. I just want to put that out there, just to be honest. And so I feel like, and we look at this graph, and one of the other things we have to acknowledge that's happened in this time is that, if we're to hold the idea that, in many ways the church has been in bed with power and Christians in so many different countries have sat at the center and have wielded great power, we also have to take responsibility for the people that we have persecuted during this time. So in the name of Jesus and in the name of the church, in the name of the kingdom of God, Christians have actually persecuted other people. Like I'm thinking about the Crusades when we persecuted Muslims. I'm thinking about, times in church history like the Spanish Inquisition when fellow Christians murdered one another in the name of right doctrine. I'm thinking about the Troubles in Ireland between the Catholics and Protestants, when people in the name of God persecuted other people, and those people who were persecuted felt like they were being persecuted because of God. And just the mess of the notion of persecution, the mess of the connection between persecution and power, the mess of understanding what really is persecution in our context. And, it just brings up a lot of tension. I think this is quite hard for us to talk about. And I guess I just also want to acknowledge that probably nearly all of us know someone who has claimed to be persecuted for their faith. But really, if we were to be honest, when we look at what they're claiming to be persecuted for, we just say, no, you're just being a bit of a numpty. Like, you might think this is because you're being persecuted for your faith, but you're actually just being a bit of a numpty. So there's a lot of tension here in kind of understanding what is it to be persecuted. And I know that there are many places around the world where Christians are genuinely persecuted for their faith, martyred. And so I'm not wanting for us to dismiss that, to ignore that, or to not talk about it. But what I am wanting to do is pull this down actually into our context, because we're living in a place where we're not actually persecuted in terms of loss of life. And so maybe what you can do as a group, just pause the video now and just have a little discussion amongst yourselves about some of the things I've said, about the nature of persecution, about, how do you see persecution in our day and age for those of us who claim to follow Jesus? Are we actually being persecuted? Are we just feeling a loss of power? And how does this all work together with that beatitude that Jesus is speaking about. So just take a little bit of time and have a discussion about that. Okay, so this is where I want to go in this next section. Basically, I want us to have a little think and a conversation and a wrestle with the idea of persecution from the perspective of, okay, if we are going to be persecuted because of righteousness, what is it exactly that we're persecuted for? I think that's kind of where I think some fruitful discussion could come out. I think if we look historically at some of the persecution that has happened, both within the church, like between different groups of the church persecuting one another, between those outside the church, persecuting those inside the church, those inside the church persecuting those outside the church, that whole dynamic. I think essentially what it comes down to is we often see persecution happening on the level of they don't believe the same way that I believe. Therefore, the tension happens around the right way to believe. But actually, I think the Beatitudes give us a slightly different perspective on the notion of persecution. And one of the reasons why I think that is because if we look at the Beatitudes as a whole, we see them kind of like working together as a ladder, or, you know, a succession of steps where each Beatitude builds on and includes the one that comes before it. And then sitting, I suppose you could say, at the top of the tree, or at the top of the pile, or at the last step, is blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. And so the notion that this Beatitude that places blessing in the place of persecution actually includes and builds upon all the Beatitudes that have come before it. So if we were to look at those, this is what we see. Persecution sits at the top of the tree of blessed are the poor in spirit, those who have a humble awareness of their need for God. Blessed are those who mourn, those who are compassionate and repentant, who have a willingness to lament and grieve both the things in their life and the things in this world. Blessed are the meek, those who choose subversive strength rather than power as a way of living in the world. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who have a desire to see oppressive power structures brought down. Blessed are the merciful, those who choose mercy, not judgment or revenge. Blessed are the pure in heart, those who live from clean hearts that are purified by love. And blessed are the peacemakers, those who work for peace. And so I think, like, the Beatitudes as a whole give us a context within which we understand what persecution might actually look like. Maybe we are persecuted because we live out those Beatitudes in the way that Jesus is calling us to live. That's very different from being persecuted because we don't believe the right way. I think maybe the invitation is to actually live differently, and out of that living differently to expect some pushback from those around us who see things differently. And I think, you know, this is what Jesus is talking about too when he goes on after, you know, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, where he says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on to say, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And of course, what isn't said, but we know to be true, is that they're going to persecute Jesus for these exact things. They're going to persecute Jesus because he was poor in spirit, because he chose to mourn, because he was meek, because he hungered and thirsted for justice, because he was merciful, because he was pure in heart, and because he did the work of peace. Jesus in the end is going to be persecuted unto death for living out the way that he is calling us to live. There's a couple of verses in 1 Peter that really, you know, state this really well for us as well. And it's in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verses 20 and 21. Peter writes, "But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it. But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you are called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And in this verse as well, we get this more explicitly, that the invitation is to enter into the same kind of suffering that Jesus entered into, to enter in the same kind of love that Jesus entered into, that we are to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who chose, self-emptying, radically forgiving, co-suffering love as his method of redemption in the world, as his way of being in the world. It's because of him, because of his way of living, that we might experience persecution. And the invitation, I suppose, is to see persecution not because of what we believe, but because of how we live out this way of life, how we live out this way of robust love, the love that looks like Jesus. And I think that the acknowledgement is that, when we live the same way as Jesus, we should expect some persecution, because the world isn't going to appreciate the people who live with such radical love, who live for such radical equality for all people, who lift up the poor and the lowly, who speak truth to the powers who want to oppress, and speak truth to those who want to use, oppression and injustice as a way of being. That those who embody mercy and those who embody forgiveness and those who embody the willingness to die rather than to use violence against their enemies are always going to be found on the outside of what's normal. And I think maybe the invitation to embrace this understanding of persecution is really this invitation to embrace this radical way of love, this radical way of Jesus. And I think this is where we can maybe bring this a little bit more into our own context, knowing that possibly we're not at risk of being persecuted unto death for our faith. But the invitation is to always enter into the suffering of radical love. That whenever we choose to truly, truly love our neighbor, love ourselves, love our God, and love our enemy, that we're going to maybe inevitably experience some suffering because of that love. But as we experience that suffering, we're actually walking in the way of Christ. We're walking exactly how he walked, that in his same co-suffering love. So this is kind of like where I see the rubber hit the road for us here in Australia with this beatitude, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. And I think, Jesus is clearly saying we should expect some difficulties when we follow his way of living. We should expect that as our lives begin to mimic and model this radical love of Jesus, we should expect to not always find ourselves in the center of appreciation by those around us. But when we speak up for injustice, when we stand with minorities and those who are being oppressed, when we speak out for mercy and what is good in our workplaces, when we refuse to let evil just run rampant, then we're going to experience a little bit of persecution. The phrase that Matthew uses, those who are persecuted, it actually literally means those who are chased away, those who are driven out, those who are caused, like those who are forced to flee. And I kind of, like, that's the actual literal meaning, and it does translate well as persecuted, but it gives, I guess, a little bit more of a word picture to the idea of what persecution is, that maybe when we're choosing to suffer in love for those around us, we're going to find ourselves on the outside of, the status quo. We're going to find ourselves on the edges, on the margins. We're going to find ourselves not at the center of culture and not at the center of systems and power structures, but just by nature of following this way of love and following our Jesus, we're going to find ourselves being forced to run from those centered power structures, and we might find ourselves on the edges. And that can be a complex and a difficult feeling, I think, to feel rejected because of the way that you're living out love, to feel marginalized because of where you stand. And yet this is what Jesus calls us into. And he actually says that is the place of blessing. When we're willing to lose our lives for the sake of love, there we find our lives. And so the invitation, I think, from Jesus is to always choose the path of suffering love. And so I wonder what it would look like for us to embrace the notion that we might be persecuted because we love too radically, rather than we might be persecuted for what we think or believe. I think the call in the Beatitudes and the call in the Sermon on the Mount is not to think great things, but to live great things. It's always a call to embodied faith. It's always a call to live out the way of Jesus, not just to think out the way of Jesus. And so maybe the persecution doesn't lie in the realm of thinking, but it actually lies in the realm of the way we choose to radically love. And so just together in your groups, in your house churches, I'd really like you to have some discussion around what I've suggested, I guess, as persecution coming via radical love, that the way we actually live out our embodied faith, the way that we live the way of Christ, the way that we express mercy and meekness and peacemaking and justice and pure in heartness, that radical lifestyle might actually mean that we find ourselves further away from the center. Maybe if you've experienced this in a way that you can actually talk about, might like to share a story from your life about a time when you actually felt like you were attempting to live out the way of Jesus and found yourself feeling a little persecuted, feeling a little bit driven out or chased away. Maybe you'd like to reflect on the fact that you don't experience much of this and what that might actually mean. And a question I'd like you to in all our groups to wrestle with, I guess, it's the question of this, like, what good do you hesitate to do because you know it might cost you something? So think, and I don't want you to answer this question in large generic ways, but in specific, like today, your day-to-day kind of life, like what's happening in your world at the moment, what's happening in your workplace, in your household, in your family groups, in your friendships, and where do you hear the call of God in your heart to do good or to radically love, but you experience a hesitation because you know that doing good or that radical love is actually going to cost you something and you're not sure if you want to pay that price. I think when we experience the tension of those things, then we're really entering into the truth of this beatitude. And when we choose to actually pay the price and to bear the cost, Jesus says, actually, you know what, the blessing is there. And so I just want to leave us with the notion that blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness might mean blessed are those who are persecuted because of the radical way in which they follow the loving example of Jesus, the radical way in which they love with all their lives and find themselves on the outside of what is considered normal. I think there's blessing there and there's challenge there. There's challenge there for me in how I live. Am I living a radical lifestyle of love that is, that imitates this Jesus that I'm following? Anyway, have some great discussion. And then to finish off, what I'd really like you to do is spend some time in prayer. There might be some things that come up for you in your group, just in your conversation, where you realize, hey, we can really pray for one another. We can really lean in and just, there might be some particular situations where people need some encouragement or some support. Please take some time to pray for one another. But the other thing I'd really like you to do is to pray for our brothers and sisters around the world who do actually experience legitimate persecution in terms of the loss of life. And I'd like you to pray for them. I'd like you to pray for the persecuted church. I'd like you to pray God's blessing upon them. I'd like you to pray God's strength upon them, and that they would have a tangible sense of the blessing of Jesus in the situation in which they find themselves. Because I think, we need to enter into some of their experience and their suffering, and we can do that through prayer and by standing with them in God's presence. So please do those things. I'll put a couple of slides up so that you get to remember everything that I've said, but enjoy some conversation and then some really good prayer together. Bless you, and we'll see you next week. We're in the building, and we're back in the building next week for a service. So great. Have a great time. See ya.